Britain is a land of ancient cities, rolling countryside, and picture-postcard villages. But behind the heritage signs and manicured gardens lies a darker history most people never see. Across England, Scotland, and Wales, there are places where entire communities vanished, swallowed by the sea, drowned beneath reservoirs, or simply walked away and never came back. In this video, we are counting down 15 British ghost towns that time forgot. From medieval settlements reclaimed by the Moor to fishing villages ripped apart overnight by storms, these are stories of ambition, loss, and silence. Some of these places you can still visit. Others exist only as shadows beneath the water. So stay with me to the end, because number 1 is a story so extraordinary it has been called Britain's Atlantis. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. Number 15. Knaptoft, Leicestershire. Drive through the quiet farmland south of Leicester and you will find a narrow lane that leads to nothing but a ruined church standing alone in a field. No village, no houses, no sign that anyone ever lived here at all. But people did. Knaptoft was a thriving medieval settlement for centuries, recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086, with a population large enough to sustain a manor, a church, and working farmland across the surrounding hills. For generations, families lived, worked, and worshipped here. Then came the Black Death in the 14th century, which thinned the population dramatically. But the real end came later, when wealthy landowners enclosed the open fields for sheep grazing, pushing the remaining villagers off the land they had farmed for generations. By the 16th century, Knaptoft was empty. Today, the broken walls of St. Mary's Church still stand among the earthworks, and if you walk the field in the right light, you can trace the outlines of streets and house plots pressed into the ground like a fingerprint. The village is gone, but the land remembers where it stood. Number 14. Hampton Gay, Oxfordshire. Just north of Oxford, tucked between the River Cherwell and the railway line, sits a place most people drive past without a second thought. A crumbling manor house stands roofless among the trees, its stone walls open to the sky. Beside it, the tiny church of St. Giles still survives, but it serves no congregation. Hampton Gay was never large, but it was a settled, working community for centuries. The manor house was the heart of it, a handsome Jacobean building surrounded by farmland and cottages. Then, on Christmas Eve 1874, a Great Western Railway train derailed on the nearby embankment and plunged into the frozen canal. 34 people died. Villagers from Hampton Gay were among the first to help pull survivors from the wreckage. The disaster scarred the parish deeply. Then in 1887, the manor house itself caught fire and was gutted. It was never rebuilt. Without the manor, the village had no center, no purpose. Families drifted away. Today, only the church and the hollow shell of the manor remain, surrounded by meadow and silence. The railway still runs past, but it no longer stops. Number 13. Tide Mills, East Sussex. If you walk the coastal path east of New Haven, past the harbour and along the shingle, you will come across a series of low concrete foundations scattered across a flat, windswept stretch of land between the railway and the sea. This is all that remains of Tide Mills. In the 18th century, an ambitious tide-powered flour mill was built here, harnessing the rise and fall of the English Channel to grind grain. A small village grew up around it. Workers' cottages, a granary, a shop. By the mid-1800s, around 100 people called this place home. But the mill could not compete with steam-powered rivals, and it closed in 1883. The village lingered on for decades, increasingly run down and neglected. During the Second World War, the abandoned buildings were used for demolition practice by Canadian troops training for the D-Day landings. After the war, what little remained was declared unfit for habitation. The last residents were moved out. Today, if you visit, you will find cracked concrete floors, low walls, and the ghostly outline of streets running through the scrubby grass. The tide still comes and goes, but the mill it once powered is gone. Number 12. Hound Tor, Dartmoor, Devon. High on the eastern edge of Dartmoor, where the granite tors break through the heather like the bones of the earth, you will find a cluster of low stone walls arranged in neat rectangles. No roofs, no doors, no glass, just stone against the sky. This is Hound Tor, a medieval settlement abandoned over 600 years ago. In the 13th century, this was a working farming community. Families grew oats, rye, and kept livestock on the thin moorland soil. The settlement had longhouses where people and animals sheltered together under one roof, separated only by a low partition. Life was hard but stable. Then the climate turned. The Little Ice Age brought colder, wetter summers, and crops began to fail on this exposed hillside. The soil grew thin, harvests dwindled. By the late 1300s, the people of Hound Tor had gone, retreating to lower, more sheltered ground. The moor took over. Bracken and heather swallowed the buildings. They were not rediscovered until archaeologists excavated them in the 1960s. Today, the stone foundations sit open to the wind, and you can walk through the rooms where families once slept, cooked, and huddled against the Dartmoor cold. It is one of the most atmospheric abandoned places in England. Quiet, exposed, and utterly alone. Number 11. Wareham, Percy, Yorkshire. Deep in the rolling chalk valleys of the Yorkshire Wolds, far from any main road, sits the most famous deserted medieval village in England. Wareham, Percy was home to people for over 600 years. At its height, it had 2 manor houses, a church, dozens of peasant dwellings, and farmland stretching across the surrounding hills. The village was recorded in the Domesday Book and grew steadily through the 12th and 13th centuries. Then things began to change. The Black Death arrived in 1348 and took a heavy toll, but the village survived the plague, only to face a slower, quieter end. Changing agricultural practices meant that wealthy landowners found it more profitable to run sheep on the land than to support a farming community. Families were gradually pushed out. By around 1500, Wareham, Percy was empty. The Church of St. Martin's continued to serve the surrounding farms for several centuries, but even that eventually fell into ruin. Today, the site is managed by English Heritage. You can walk among the earthworks, trace the outlines of houses and streets, and stand inside the roofless church. Sheep graze where families once gathered. It is a powerful, quiet place and a reminder that even 6 centuries of continuous life can be undone by economics. And hey, before we move on to our next entry, I hope you are enjoying this video so far. If you are, why not give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend who loves hidden British history. It really does help us out. Right, let's continue. Number 10. Polfail, Argyll, Scotland. On the west coast of the Cowal Peninsula, overlooking the still waters of Loch Fyne, there once stood a village that no one ever lived in. Polfail was built between 1975 and 1977 during the early rush of the North Sea oil boom. The British government purchased land at nearby Portavadie to construct a massive dry dock for building concrete oil platforms. Over 830,000 cubic meters of rock and earth were excavated to create the dock, one of the largest man-made excavations in Europe at the time. A purpose-built housing village was constructed alongside it with enough capacity for up to 500 workers. Streets were laid, houses were finished, everything was ready. but the orders for oil platforms never came. Design problems with the concrete gravity platforms, rising costs, and a shifting market meant that not a single platform was ever built at Portavadi. The village of Polfail sat empty from the day it was completed. For over 40 years, the houses stood vacant, slowly decaying, their windows smashed, their walls covered in graffiti. In 2009, an artistic collective known as Agents of Change visited the empty streets and turned the crumbling walls into a haunting outdoor gallery. The village was finally demolished by the end of 2016 at a cost of around £300,000. Today, the site has been cleared. Polfail is not a ruin. It is something stranger, a place that was born dead, a village with no memories, no community, and no past. Just an idea that never took its first breath. Number 9. Nant Gwrthyn, Lune Peninsula, Wales. On the remote northern coast of the Lune Peninsula, hidden at the bottom of a steep, winding track that drops through dense woodland to the sea, sits a cluster of stone cottages arranged around a narrow lane. This is Nant Gwrthyn, once a thriving granite quarrying village. In the 1860s, quarrying began here in earnest, cutting stone from the dramatic headlands that frame the cove. Workers and their families built a community in this isolated valley. There was a chapel, a row of terraced cottages, a schoolhouse. At its busiest, around 100 people lived and worked here, hauling stone by tramway down to the jetty where ships waited to carry it away. But the quarry's fortunes were always tied to demand, and demand faded. The quarry closed and reopened several times, but each time fewer workers returned. By the 1950s, only a handful of residents remained. The last permanent inhabitant left in 1959. The buildings fell into ruin. Roofs collapsed. Vegetation crept over the walls. For decades, Nant Gwrthyn was one of the most hauntingly beautiful, abandoned villages in Wales, accessible only on foot down the steep valley path. Then, in the 1970s, a remarkable thing happened. A local doctor named Carl Claus led a campaign to save the village and transform it into a Welsh language and heritage centre. It took years of fundraising and restoration, but the centre opened and still operates today. Nant Gwrthyn is one of the rare ghost towns on this list that has been brought back to life. But walk down to the old quarry workings at the edge of the cove, and you can still feel the silence of the decades it spent forgotten. Number 8. Mardale Green, Cumbria. If you stand on the western shore of Horsewater on a normal day, you see a long, narrow lake stretching into the fells, surrounded by some of the most beautiful scenery in the Lake District. But beneath that water lies a village. Mardale Green was a small farming community in the Mardale Valley, home to the Dunbull Inn, a church, a schoolhouse, and a scatter of working farms. The valley had been settled for centuries, a quiet, close-knit place where families had farmed the same land for generations. Then, in the 1920s, Manchester Corporation chose the valley as the site for a new reservoir to supply water to the growing city, over 100 miles to the south. Despite fierce opposition from local residents and supporters, the plan went ahead. Families were given notice to leave. The Dunbull Inn was demolished. The Church of Holy Trinity was dismantled stone by stone. Even the dead were exhumed from the churchyard and reinterred at Shap. By 1935, the dam was complete and the waters began to rise. Mardale Green disappeared beneath Haweswater. For most of the year, it is invisible. But in exceptionally dry summers, when the water level drops, the ruins of Mardale Green reappear. Stone walls, old field boundaries, and the foundations of buildings emerge from the receding water like ghosts surfacing for air. Each time it happens, crowds gather to see what remains. Then the rain returns, the water rises, and Mardale Green sinks back beneath the surface, waiting. Number 7. Derwent and Ashopton, Derbyshire. In the upper Derwent Valley, surrounded by dark conifer plantations and the bleak moorland of the Peak District, sit 2 reservoirs that hide a secret beneath their surface. Lady Bower Reservoir was completed in 1943, and to fill it, 2 villages had to die. Derwent and Ashopton were small but complete communities. Derwent had a fine 17th century hall, a church with a spire visible for miles, a school, and rows of stone cottages. Ashopton, just down the valley, was a hamlet clustered around the Snake Road, with a pub, a packhorse bridge, and farms. Both had stood for centuries. When the decision was made to dam the valley, residents were relocated, buildings were demolished, and the valley was sealed. As the water rose, the spire of Derwent Church remained visible above the surface for several years, a haunting marker of what lay below. It was eventually demolished in 1947 for safety reasons. But like Mardale Green, Derwent has a habit of returning. During droughts, the reservoir level drops and the ruins appear. Walls, paths, and foundations rise from the mud, drawing visitors who come to walk among the bones of a drowned village. The Derwent Valley is also famous for its wartime connection. The Lady Bower and Derwent reservoirs were used by the 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters, to practice low-level flying runs before their legendary 1943 raid on the Ruhr dams. A memorial stands near the dam. The valley is steeped in history, some of it celebrated, some of it submerged. Number 6. Holsons, Devon. On the exposed coast of Start Bay in South Devon, clinging to a rocky ledge between the cliffs and the sea, stand the skeletal remains of a fishing village that was literally torn apart by the ocean. Holsons was a small but resilient community. By the 1890s, it had around 37 houses, a population of over 150 people, a pub called the London Inn, a chapel, and a post office. The villagers made their living from crab fishing, and for generations, the wide shingle beach in front of the village had protected them from the worst of the sea. Then, in 1897, the Admiralty authorized the dredging of hundreds of thousands of tons of shingle from the seabed offshore to use in the expansion of Devonport Dockyard in Plymouth. Within a few years, the beach level dropped by nearly 4 meters. The village's natural shield was gone. Storms began to batter the exposed buildings. Walls cracked. Foundations shifted. Repeated protests from the villagers were met with bureaucratic indifference. Then, on the night of the 26th of January 1917, a ferocious storm hit Start Bay. By midnight, 4 houses had been completely demolished and none survived intact. Remarkably, all 79 villagers escaped during a lull in the storm at low tide. But when the next high tide came on the 28th, the sea walls broke and most of the remaining village was destroyed. Only 1 house survived, the highest in the village, belonging to the Pretijon family. The local newspaper ran the headline, "The beach went to Devonport and the cottages went to the sea." Today, the ruins of Holsons cling to the cliff face, their empty fireplaces and broken walls visible from a viewing platform on the clifftop above. You can no longer walk among them. The path itself has been claimed by erosion. The sea is still taking what remains. Number 5. Tyneham, Dorset. Nestled in a valley on the Jurassic coast, surrounded by the rolling Purbeck Hills, sits a village frozen in 1943. Tyneham was a quiet, picturesque Dorset community. It had a manor house, a medieval church, a schoolhouse, a row of stone cottages, a post office, and farmland stretching up to the ridgeline above. Around 225 people called it home. Then, in November 1943, with the Second World War at its height, the War Office requisitioned the entire village and the surrounding area for use as a military training ground in preparation for the D-Day landings. Every resident was ordered to leave. They were given 1 month's notice. A handwritten note was pinned to the church door by the villagers as they departed, which read in part, "Please treat the church and houses with care. We have given up our homes, where many of us have lived for generations, to help win the war to keep men free. We shall return one day and thank you for treating the village kindly." They never returned. After the war ended, the military retained the land. Repeated campaigns by former residents and their descendants to reclaim the village were unsuccessful. The Ministry of Defence still controls the area. Tyneham now sits within the Lulworth Ranges, and the village is open to the public only on certain weekends and during school holidays when the ranges are not in use. If you visit, you will find the church and the schoolhouse carefully preserved, with displays about the village's history. But the cottages are roofless shells. The gardens have run wild. The lane through the village leads nowhere. It is a profoundly strange and moving place, a community that gave everything and received nothing in return. Number 4. Imber, Wiltshire. If Tyneham is Dorset's lost village, then Imber is its twin on Salisbury Plain. The story is almost identical, and no less heartbreaking. Imber had been a settled community on the plain for at least 900 years. It was recorded in the Domesday Book. By the early 20th century, it had a 13th century church, a manor house, a pub called the Bell Inn, a school, a Baptist chapel, and scattered farms. Around 150 people lived there. Then in 1943, the same year Tyneham was requisitioned, the residents of Imber were told to leave. American troops needed the village and the surrounding land for training exercises ahead of the invasion of Europe. As with Tyneham, the villagers were promised they could return after the war. As with Tyneham, that promise was broken. When the war ended, the Ministry of Defence refused to give the village back. Former resident Albert Nash led a protest march to Imber in 1961, carrying a banner that read, "It is wrong to keep good houses empty." He took his case to the High Court and lost. The village has been used ever since as a training ground for military operations in built-up areas, a purpose it still serves today. The houses have been modified, reinforced, and scarred by decades of exercises. The only original building treated with care is the Church of St. Giles, a beautiful 13th century structure that is maintained by the church's Conservation Trust and open to the public on a handful of days each year, including around Christmas and Easter. If you visit on one of those rare open days, you can walk the single street of Imber, past the shell of the Bell Inn and the hollow cottages, and step inside a church that has somehow survived everything. It is one of the most quietly devastating places in England, a village that was taken and never given back. I hope you are enjoying this countdown. If you are, please consider sharing this video with someone who would find these stories as fascinating as you do. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's move on, because the final 3 entries are the most powerful stories on this list. Number 3. Capel-Selan, Gwynedd, Wales. Of all the drowned villages in Britain, none carries the weight of political fury and cultural grief quite like Capel-Selan. This was not a medieval hamlet lost to the passage of time. This was a living, breathing, Welsh-speaking community, destroyed in living memory by an Act of Parliament. Capel-Selan sat in the Tryweryn Valley, to the northwest of Bala in Gwynedd. It was a small farming village, home to around 68 people. It had 12 working farms, a post office, a school, and a chapel. Crucially, It was one of the last truly Welsh-only speaking communities in the area, a place where the language, culture, and traditions of rural Wales survived intact. Then, in 1955, Liverpool City Corporation announced plans to flood the Tryweryn Valley to create a new reservoir, Llyn Selyn, to supply water to the city of Liverpool and the Wirral. The people of Capel Selyn objected. Local councils across Wales objected. All 36 Welsh members of Parliament either voted against the bill or abstained. It made no difference. The Liverpool Corporation Act was passed by the Westminster Parliament in 1957, bypassing the need for permission from any authority in Wales. For the people of Wales, this was not just about water. It was about power, identity, and the right of a nation to protect its own communities. Protests and marches continued for nearly a decade. Hundreds of people travelled to Liverpool to demonstrate. In 1962, 2 men damaged machinery at the construction site and were arrested. But the dam could not be stopped. Construction began in 1960. Families were moved out. Buildings were demolished. The cemetery was relocated to higher ground. The dam was completed in 1965, and on the 21st of October that year, the reservoir was officially opened amid heavy protest. The village of Capel Selyn disappeared beneath 68 million tons of water, but it was never forgotten. The phrase Cofich Dryweryn, meaning "Remember Tryweryn," became one of the most powerful slogans in Welsh political life, painted on a wall near Aberystwyth that has become an unofficial national monument. The drowning of Capel Selyn is widely credited with fueling the rise of Plaid Cymru and the broader movement for Welsh devolution. Liverpool City Council formally apologised in 2005, 40 years too late, for the families who lost everything. And every now and then, in unusually dry summers, the water level of Llyn Selyn drops and the ruins of Capel surface once more. Walls, foundations, and the outlines of a lost community appear above the waterline. Then the rain returns and the village sinks again. Number 2. St Kilda, Scotland. More than 40 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, further out into the Atlantic than any other inhabited place in Britain, stands a cluster of sea stacks and sheer cliffs rising from the ocean. This is St Kilda, the most remote community that ever existed in the British Isles. People had lived on these islands for thousands of years. The main island, Hirta, supported a small population that survived by farming, fishing, and above all, by harvesting seabirds and their eggs from the towering cliffs. It was an astonishing way of life, brutal and precarious, entirely dependent on the sea and the seasons. The villagers lived in a single row of cottages along a crescent-shaped street overlooking Village Bay. They shared everything. They governed themselves by a daily meeting known as the St Kilda Parliament, held each morning on the street to decide the day's work. For centuries, this system worked. St Kilda was isolated, yes, but self-sufficient. Then contact with the outside world began to change everything. From the mid-19th century, Victorian tourists started arriving in summer, bringing money, goods, and diseases the islanders had no immunity to. In 1876, during a food shortage, the islanders sent out a distress signal in a small wooden container attached to a sheep's bladder, set adrift in the current. It became known as the St Kilda mailboat. Outbreaks of influenza, measles, and other illnesses took a terrible toll. Young people began to leave for the mainland, drawn by the promise of an easier life. After the First World War, a naval detachment had been stationed on the island, bringing regular mail and supplies. When that support was withdrawn, the isolation felt even sharper than before. The harsh winter of 1929 pushed the remaining population to breaking point. Then in early 1930, a young woman named Mary Gillies fell ill and was taken to the mainland, where she died in hospital. It was the final blow. By May 1930, the remaining population had dwindled to just 36 people, 13 men, 10 women, and 13 children spread across only 10 occupied households. 20 of them signed a petition to the government asking to be evacuated. On the morning of the 29th of August 1930, the islanders gathered their belongings, locked their doors, left an open Bible and a small pile of oats in each house as a farewell gesture, and boarded HMS Harabel. Some of the older islanders looked back as the islands shrank on the horizon. The younger ones looked forward towards a mainland they barely knew. Many of the evacuated St. Kildans struggled to adapt. They were resettled in Morven, in Argyll, and in parts of Fife and Ross-shire. Some never felt at home again. Today, St. Kilda is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the only place in Britain to hold that status for both its natural and cultural significance. The row of cottages still stands on Hirta, maintained by the National Trust for Scotland. A small military radar station operates there. Volunteers visit each summer to carry out conservation work, but no one lives there permanently. The street is empty. The Parliament no longer meets. If you stand on Hirta and look out across Village Bay, with the great stacks of Borre and Stack and Armin rising from the sea in the distance, you can feel the weight of everything that was lost. St. Kilda is not just an abandoned village. It is the end of a way of life that lasted longer than most civilizations. Extinguished not by disaster, but by the slow, quiet erosion of everything that once made it possible. Number 1. Dunwich, Suffolk. If you drive along the quiet lanes of the Suffolk coast and arrive at the tiny village of Dunwich today, you will find a handful of houses, a pub, a small museum, and a fish and chip shop. It is, by all appearances, an unremarkable coastal settlement. But beneath the grey waters of the North Sea, just offshore, lies the largest underwater medieval city in Europe. Dunwich was once one of the most important ports in England. In the early medieval period, it served as the capital of the Kingdom of the East Angles. By the 13th century, it had grown to rival the City of London in physical size, with an estimated population of around 10,000 people. It had 8 churches, 5 houses of religious orders, 3 chapels, 2 hospitals, and a thriving harbour that connected it to trade routes stretching across the continent. Ships came and went carrying wool, grain, fish, and salt. The town had its own mint. It sent 2 members to Parliament. Dunwich was wealthy, powerful, and seemingly permanent. But its position on the soft, sandy cliffs of the Suffolk coast made it vulnerable to a force no amount of wealth could resist. The North Sea had been eroding the coastline for centuries, but in 1286 and again in 1328, catastrophic storms struck the coast with devastating force. Huge sections of the town were swept into the sea. The harbour silted up, choking off the trade that was Dunwich's lifeblood. Ships could no longer dock. Merchants moved to other ports. The town began to shrink. Over the following centuries, erosion continued its relentless advance. Churches, streets, houses, entire neighborhoods slipped over the crumbling cliffs and into the waves. The Black Death in 1348 thinned the remaining population further. By 1602, Dunwich was a quarter of its peak size. By 1832, it had become one of Britain's most notorious rotten boroughs, still sending 2 members to Parliament despite having almost no residents. All Saints' Church, the last of the medieval churches, was abandoned in 1755 as the cliff edge crept closer. Its tower finally collapsed into the sea in the early 1900s. Today, only a single gravestone from its burial ground remains on the cliff top, belonging to Jacob Forster, buried in 1796. It stands at the edge of the cliff, the last marker of a graveyard that is now entirely beneath the waves. Bones from the eroded churchyard still occasionally fall from the cliff face onto the beach below. In 2008, researchers from the University of Southampton used acoustic imaging to map the seabed off Dunwich for the first time. What they found astonished them. The medieval ruins were still there, largely intact, sitting beneath 3 to 10 meters of silty water. Churches, streets, and hundreds of buildings, all preserved on the ocean floor. It was, as one researcher put it, as if the entire town had simply slipped off the edge of the land and settled on the seabed. And then there is the legend. Locals have said for centuries that, on quiet nights when the sea is still, you can hear the bells of Dunwich's drowned churches ringing beneath the waves. Whether that is true or simply the kind of story a place like this demands, no one can say for certain. But if you stand on the beach at Dunwich at dusk, with the grey North Sea stretching out before you and the crumbling cliffs at your back, it does not feel like a legend. It feels like a memory. Dunwich is not just a ghost town. It is the story of an entire city, slowly, silently erased by the sea over 800 years. A place that was once as important as London, now reduced to a pub, a museum, and a single gravestone standing at the edge of a cliff. It is the ultimate reminder that nothing built by human hands is permanent, not even a city. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to share it with your friends, and I will see you in the next one.